Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
Anti-Semitism, people used to make all kinds of differentiations, anti-religion, anti-Jewish, anti-this, anti-that. What it boils down to is anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism. And it has really, it used to be two words. Now it's one word, and it has become a single, it has been given an international definition, okay? And that was done by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. All right, I'm going to read their statement, which includes another organization, the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial. A statement was made a number of years ago, and I'm going to read it. The IHRA also gave a whole list of examples of what constitutes anti-Semitic activity or writing or statements, whatever. And so it's rather all-inclusive. I'm going to read it. If you want to read it yourselves or copy it or whatever, just go on to Google with and just capital I, capital H, capital R, capital A, and it will take you to a number of websites. When I turned it on, the first IHRA was the International Hot Rod Association. I don't think that's what you want. But right below it, there was the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. You click on that, and you can get everything that I'm going to read to you now. Okay, so I don't have to send it to you. All right, but I do want to read it. It's a few pages. I'm going to pause at certain points, so you can comment. But it boils down to three words, as you will hear in just a moment. Okay. The IHRA is an intergovernmental organization with 35 member countries and 9 observer countries, founded in 1998 by former Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson. We address issues related to the Holocaust and genocide of the Roma. In the spirit of the Stockholm Declaration that states, with humanity still scarred by anti-Semitism and xenophobia, the international community shares a solemn responsibility to fight those evils. Okay, with that in mind, the international community, the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial called the IHRA plenary in Budapest 2015 to adopt the following working definition of anti-Semitism. Okay, on 26 May 2016, the plenary in Bucharest decided to adopt the following non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. Quote, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews, period. Hatred toward, that's the three-word definition. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. End of quote. All right. To guide the IHRA in its work, the following examples may serve as illustrations. Manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity, and it is often used to blame Jews for why things go wrong. It is expressed in speech, writing, visual forms, and action, and employs sinister stereotypes and negative character traits. Contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplace, and the religious sphere could, taking into account the overall context, include, but are not limited to, calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as collective, such as, but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy, or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions, accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews, denying the fact, scope, mechanisms, e.g. gas chambers, or intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of National Socialist Germany and its supporters and accomplices during World War II, denying that fact. Regarding the state of Israel, accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by, for example, claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, using the symbols and images associated with classical anti-Semitism, for example, claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israel policy to that of the Nazis, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. Anti-Semitic acts are criminal when they are defined by law. Criminal acts are anti-Semitic when the targets of attacks, whether they are people or property, such as buildings, schools, places of worship, and cemeteries, are selected because they are or perceived to be Jewish or linked to Jews. Anti-Semitic discrimination is the denial of Jews of opportunities or services available to others, and is illegal in many countries. Okay, so that's it. I just wanted you to hear it. You can see it's quite expansive. They try to cover as many bases as possible. Right now, any quick responses? Yeah, go ahead, Bert.
There's just so much there. It's hard to absorb everything. But the issue of whether being opposed to the existence of Israel is anti-Semitic is, I think, a complicated issue involving not just the peoplehood of Jews, but also politics and dispute over land. And that was the only thing in everything you mentioned that seemed to me to be quite complicated. I think that people can be opposed to Israel the way they can be opposed to any other country in the world, and not necessarily be anti-Semitic. But I acknowledge that's very complicated.
Yeah, no, but I mean, the question is, you can be critical of a country, but I mean, do we have a right to say Russia should be wiped off the map? I mean, is that a legitimate thing, excuse me, for people to have in their minds, just to think like that? Because it means send a bomb. I mean, it leads to all kinds of justifications of actions. The point is, if I think what it's saying is, if a country exists, and the country does bad things, right? Yes, I mean, were people saying, I mean, after World War II, destroy Germany? I mean, is that a legitimate thing to say? Forget about something. I mean, technically speaking, Germany is a rather late phenomenon historically, because for centuries it was divided up into different principalities. We know that. I think Germany as a united country was a product of the 19th century. But the fact is, though, it's a defined country. So one can criticize what happened in Germany, criticize how the German people dealt with that, and learn from that and say this is something that cannot happen again. It should not happen. I mean, so I'm not sure that you can. I mean, I don't like. I would, if I were as an American, if Russia said the United States should cease to exist, I would say that that's anti-Americanism, right? And that's the point. Okay, Errol.
I may have misheard you, but was this definition initiated by an effort to address the extermination of the Romas?
Well, that's part of it. No, that was added on. Yeah, that is it's there. It says that.
Oh, but it wasn't the initial stimulus.
Well, I don't know where this began. It's possible. I can't answer that question.
Okay.
Yeah, because, they were a target.
Sure.
There's no question about it. I mean, when you go in Germany, when you across the street from the National Memorial in Berlin by the Brandenburg Gate, I don't know if you've ever been there. It's a huge, huge thing, and it leaves you very confused, and that's the whole idea, as I understand it. But across the street from that is a memorial to the homosexuals who were killed, who were pinpointed and murdered because they were aberrations, and that's appropriate, And I don't know if there's a memorial to the Roma. I don't know, but Jews were often mentioned in the same breath as gypsies. Jews and gypsies put in the same category. So, yeah. Anything else? Oh, yeah, Barbara.
I'm not sure if this is the time, but and you can stop me if you want to discuss this later. When I was in Sunday school as a 14-year-old, going back 72 years, the first 6 weeks of school, they were teaching us that everybody hates us.
Yeah.
And at that point, I had never seen anybody hate me or anybody else. And we were going down to a parent-teacher association meeting. And I said to the teacher, for God's sakes, why don't you teach us some history, Jewish history or Hebrew? Why do we have to learn that everybody hates us? He said, don't take the name of the Lord in vain. So I repeated it and yelled it out loud. And then I left and said, tell my mother I'll be outside and I won't be returning to this class.
Yeah.
Now, here I am taking a class in anti-Semitism. As an adult, it's a different thing because we know that more obviously now that things have changed, and it's a terrible thing what's going on in the world these days for what's happening to Jews. But it just reminds me of teaching. So I guess I'm disturbed at the idea of teaching this to young people, that they had to be watching out for it. I think it's different when we're going to study it from a more meaningful way.
Yeah, let me cut you off. I hear. Yeah. I can't answer that question because that requires somebody who actually knows what's appropriate education at what ages. Okay, but I think I would agree that just having that jammed down your throat, 6 weeks of education on this subject. I mean, Deborah Lipstadt, who you all have heard of, I assume, she's an expert in these fields. She's always said the best defense against anti-Semitism are people who understand what it means to be Jewish. Okay, that way you can have the personal strength and awareness of what you really represent and respond from that perspective. And the point is, what you're saying, there's value in what you're saying is, if I go to a Hebrew school class, and that's what I learn, then I'm not learning the essence of Judaism. All I'm learning is that I am a potentially persecuted person, and I gotta look out because the goyim are going to kill me, right? And we all know that not every goy hates a Jew. Nobody is saying that. I mean, if the whole world, sadly, more and more countries are developing negative images of the state of Israel. I mean, we hear that all the time, and that's partially a distortion. We know that. But the point is, most human beings are not necessarily anti-Semites, okay? But you'll see the deep roots of anti-Semitism are not just the fact that, one person who's Jewish tried to defraud a Gentile, right? I mean, anti-Semites will make a big deal about that. Most human beings understand that's a bad person.
Right.
Being Jewish is really irrelevant. Look, there are times, in this country where people said the same thing about Italians. Every Italian was a mafiosi. I mean, there were people who were believing those things. Get them out of the country. Why are they here? All right. So, I mean, this happens. Okay. And it shouldn't happen. I mean, that way of thinking. So anyhow, all right. Now, end of that. As I said, if you want to read this yourself and mull over it, IHRA, not the Hot Rod Association, but this. All right, the second listing. It's amazing they put the hot rods first. Anyway, I know why they do that. All right. Anyhow, as mentioned in the announcement of the class, we are going to study 3 different periods, and they are the ancient period, which I'm giving, the dates I'm telling you right now are just for class purposes. It's not a precise historical definition. Just know that, okay? So we're looking from about 250 BCE to 100 CE in the ancient period, 600 CE. No, I think I said 100. 250 BCE to 600 CE is the ancient period. The medieval period is 600 CE to 1700 CE, and the modern period is 1700 to 2024. All right, a lot of material. I mean, I'm telling you right now, I planned a 10 meeting class. It's very likely that we will spill over further into the winter and spring, because I don't know, and I don't know if you're going to be willing to stick through it, the whole thing. But the point is, it's complex. It's fascinating. It's scary. It's complex, and this is something adults can study. Barbara, have that in mind. This is not something, as you said, that young children can appreciate. High school kids can do this, college kids. It's heavy stuff. But I'm going to begin with something a little bit lighter, all right, which technically does not fall within my time frame, as you now see. In the Bible, we have 2 instances of conspiracy theories against the Israelites or Jews. Do you want to take a guess as to what are the 2 conspiracy theories? I'll read you the texts in a minute. What are the 2 conspiracy theories in the Hebrew Bible?
Wasn't there one that in Egypt that there were going to be so many Jews that they were going to be like a 5th column in the
Pharaoh? Exactly, Pharaoh. Right?
Yeah.
And what's the second one?
We're talking about the Pentateuch or the Tanakh?
I said the Bible.
So you meant everything.
Barbara.
Well, I agree with Bert about Pharaoh, but also when the spies were sent to Canaan, and people scared them off, would that be? No, okay.
The people who scared them off were giants, Canaanites, not Jews. Okay.
Is a Purim story?
The what?
Purim.
Yes. Bingo. Bravo. Haman. Interesting. His name begins with an H. Somebody else we know begins with an H. Yes. All right. So here is specifically, this is Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 to 9. For those of you who are familiar with Bible, with Torah, the various strata of Torah, this is a JP and E conglomerate of different sources, probably redacted somewhere between 800 and 600 BCE. Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. So this is going back to some point in time, pick a date, 1300 BCE. Well, it depends. If you say, if it's 400 years of slavery, I mean, if you take that number literally, then you got to go back to about 1600 BC. Okay, but the numbers there, forget about that for now. But it would be at some point in ancient Egyptian history. Okay, Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, but the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. Then, verse 8 of chapter 1 of Exodus. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. Okay, so there's the line, right? They're growing in numbers. In the event of war, they will join our enemies in fighting against us. Conspiracy theory, right? Even though they were quiet shepherds who kept to themselves, they were up north in the northwest corner of Egypt, where it's fertile land for grazing. Pharaoh gave it to them, and that was it. Okay. Now, there is history in a sense behind this, not with respect to the Israelites, but the fact is, Pharaoh did engage in wars with Ethiopia, for example, frequently, and to the south. And so one can imagine that may have been behind the biblical account of what was the Egyptian, what happened within Egypt that ultimately resulted in this horrible catastrophe of the slavery. But we don't know. But there's no documentary evidence on this whatsoever. Nothing. All right? But in a sense, it is not the interesting thing. It was sort of prescient, because that is, as you will hear, is what later generations of anti-Semites would be saying. Okay? Just to jump way ahead, with the Maccabean revolt, right, in 160 something, right, or the 766 revolt against Rome, right, Jews in the Roman Empire at that time developed a reputation of being, very, very belligerent against the ruling power, rising up against the ruling power. And by that time, this had been circulating through the Greek translation of the Torah, and the translation began sometime in the 3rd century BCE. Okay, so this idea of what Pharaoh said was percolating. And so in a certain sense, they came together. And that interpretation was actually what was given to the, what shall we say, ignorant understanding or lack of understanding of why these rebellions took place.
And weren't there echoes of that in Charlottesville?
Huh?
There were echoes of that in Charlottesville. The Jews are coming to take
well, they won't replace us. They won't replace us.
Right. I mean, that's contemporary.
Yeah, but you're right. But that was also the notion why the Jews support open immigration, because we're responsible for bringing all these bad immigrants into the country. That's also what they were saying. Yeah, right. But that concept of a conspiracy theory. So you already have that, interestingly, in the second book of the Torah. Okay, and remember, that information also fed into the Christian traditions. I mean, how Christians could view Jews from time to time. Although the fact is, the Jews under Christianity, with the exception of a brief period of time, never had the power of the Christian community or the church or the Christian kings. Okay, so it sort of was empty because Jews didn't do that. We couldn't do it. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, which also, by the way, fed into this theory. Think about it. The Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 BCE, 3 years, a more devastating war than the 66 to 70 war. More devastating than the war that destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Okay? All right. Okay. So that's that one. Yeah, Bert?
I'm just going to say I find it interesting sometimes to ask non-Jews how many Jews they think there are in the world.
Yeah.
You get amazing numbers.
I did that with a class that I once taught at the Loyola Marymount. They have a Jewish studies program. It was a class in Jewish religious practices. Wonderful class. Okay, really enjoyed it thoroughly. But the first day I said, how many Jews are there in the world? And I gave them a different number, 5 million, 15 million, 50 million, 100 million, 200 million. Most of the answers, and this was a mixed class of Jews and non-Jews. As I read the numbers, when I hit 15 million, 2 or 3 raised their hands. All right. More hands went up when I hit the 50 million, 100 million, or 200 million. Mm-hmm. All right. No idea. But you think about it, especially living in Los Angeles or New York or Miami, the newspapers are going to talk about Israel all the time, right? Because of the large Jewish population. So they talk about Israel. And so therefore the numbers, oh God, they're all over the place. And of course we can, the anti-Semites would be saying today, as they have for a long time, we control the media. So the newspapers, of course, the fact that the newspapers are sometimes very critical of Israel, that doesn't change their thinking. Okay, that's the irony of the whole thing. All right. Okay, so now Haman. All right, we're looking now in Esther, the book of Esther, right? Megillat Esther. We read on Purim, chapter 3. We're going to read now verses 5 through 10 of that. All right, this is book of Esther, chapter 3, verses 5 to 10. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or bow low to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, having been told who Mordecai's people were. Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordecai's people, throughout the kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, Pur, which means the lot was cast before Haman concerning every day and every month, until it fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, there was a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. And it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for deposit in the royal treasury. Thereupon the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the foe of the Jews. Okay, so here are the key words. We do not obey the king's laws, right? We have our own law. Okay, we ignore yours. So they're illegal, so to speak. Right? They do not follow the authority of the king. That's what this is saying. That's sort of equivalent to one second. Yes. The reason why Jesus was crucified. The reason why Jesus was crucified is because he claimed to be the king of the Jews. That's what it says in the Gospels. But that's also what the Romans did. They would tack on the top of the cross a sign indicating the crime that the person on the cross was accused of. And whether this is the exact wording or not, but it's sort of lèse majesté, right, where they reject the authority of the ruler. Okay, that's what it says. That Jesus, by calling himself the King of the Jews, had rejected the authority of Caesar. And that's capital crime. That's what they put up. All right. Anyhow, so here again, right? Conspiracy theory. Were the Jews doing such things? Of course not. Again, quiet people. Here, of course, because the Jews, because of Esther and Mordecai getting to Ahasuerus in time, an announcement went out and the Jews prepared. And it says, now this is interesting, later on in the book of Esther that the Jews killed 75,000 Persians after the attacks began. And we won the war. And Mordecai became prime minister. Okay, that's what's there. It's the story of Esther, the book of Esther, is it's a mix, mostly a story, but there's clearly a Persian background there. There's no Persian record whatsoever of something like this ever happening. And if it were something that serious, I guarantee you it would have been recorded. So it's a story. But again, if you're reading the Bible, on the one hand, you see, what happens when you have this strange people. Because remember, throughout history, what was a major request of the Jewish communities wherever they were living, from the Roman period down till the 20th century? What did the Jews ask for from the ruling government? They asked for permission to follow their own traditions. Now, it didn't mean that they would work beyond. They recognized that the law of the government had to be followed. There's a principle in Jewish law that was mentioned frequently among Jews, which is dina de malchuta dina. The law of the land is the law. So when it came to criminal acts, right? If it went to a non-Jewish court and the court ruled against the Jew, so be it. Very often those would be sent to a Jewish court, okay, and they would rule, and if that was, and there were certain punishments that the king's courts could, impose that the Jewish courts could not. So it was always done never was it done within a structure, with a rebellion, a rejection, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, yeah, the Jews' leadership sometimes definitely criticized the king among themselves if they thought that something was unjust. But the point is, they never had the power to do anything. But still, this notion is being perpetuated. They have their own laws, so they are separate. They think that they're better than we are, right? And you have time in the Middle Ages when the Jews living in towns were seen as competition to the Christians living in town. This is like in the 12th and 13th centuries when the towns and cities in Europe began to burgeon, right? And Jews were there, and Christians were there. There were Jewish merchants and Christian merchants. Okay, competition. Who's the majority? Christians. So if there is some sort of violence or negative feeling that is expressed, where does it go? So that's another feeder, by the way, into the history of anti-Semitism. We'll get to that later. All right. Okay. Questions, comments. All right. That's the Bible. All right. Moving on. We are now talking about, I'm not going to the details. This is an outline. Okay. So I'm going to go through this so you should understand what to look forward to. Okay. It'll just whet your appetite to study all this wonderful literature. All right. So first of all, we're going to look at Hellenistic Egyptian anti-Semitism. We're talking from possibly 3rd century BCE down through the 1st century BCE. And there are these anti-Semitic stories and traditions that get passed forward. A major source for us on this is going to be Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote a book called Against Appian. Appian was an Egyptian writer, philosopher of sorts, and worked with the government. We're talking around 40 BCE, and he was an anti-Semite. And he was a purveyor in his writings of anti-Semitic traditions that go back 100 and 200 years before that. So he said, and that is something that Josephus tells us. So we will be reading those sources, and you'll see they'll speak for themselves. Fascinating stuff. You will see the first blood libel, something approaching a blood libel in that material. And we're talking, that source was actually BCE. Okay, we'll see what that's about. So that's the first one. Then we have Roman anti-Semitism. And here, what we're going to look at is a primary source, principal source, unfortunately, is Tacitus, the great Roman historian, who wrote his book about, the histories of Rome. And it's interesting because he was associated with the Flavian household that Josephus was. Josephus ended up in Rome, and he was a member of the court of the Flavian dynasty, the emperor's dynasty. He was very close with the emperors. And by the way, he used his position to try to generate a positive image of the Jews as a people. We can talk about that more when we get to that. Because everybody used to say, I remember I had a student from Israel, bright lady, when I was studying Jewish historiography. So I mentioned the fact that Josephus, as soon as I said that word, she said, Boged in Hebrew. Traitor, traitor. He was a traitor because he turned against his people. Well, she was right in a sense. So I gave her as her project, had to write a paper. I said, read Josephus's War of the Jews, where he describes in great detail his interpretation of what happened that led up to 70 CE. Okay? And he was there. And he was part of it. Anyhow. And then tell me what you think of Josephus. So she did her work. She wrote a 25-page paper in Hebrew, I must tell you. And I read it. It was fine. She had good handwriting. Anyway, she says to me, but after she finishes the research, Lo kol kach boged. He wasn't really that much of a traitor. I said, you're right. Because you read the Jewish War, you will see the Jews are one of the most noble people on earth. He compares them to the Romans. Very noble people. The problem was they were manipulated by corrupt Roman officials, corrupt priests, and these wacko, crazy rebels who pushed them to extreme things. So it wasn't the Jewish people. Okay, anyway. So, but he will report to us on the stories that were told about Jews by pagan Romans, or no, not just Romans, pre-Roman Egyptian, Hellenized Egyptian people. Okay, all right. And then the final of the ancient things, of course, is going to be Christianity. So we will read some selections from the New Testament. And we will read, including Paul, and certain segments of the four Gospels, two in particular. And then we're going to read some church fathers, particularly Origen and John Chrysostom. Origen is around 200. Chrysostom is around 380. And the lovely words that they have to say. All right, and these were people whose writings transcended chronologically their own period. Origen became a leading ancient interpreter of the Bible and of the New Testament and of Christian ideology down through the Middle Ages. Origen was he studied with Jews, by the way. He probably knew a little Hebrew. And so he understood, he had that material. In spite of that, you'll see what he had to say. Chrysostom was the bishop in Antioch around 388. And we know the year, 388 CE. He is writing he is in his position as bishop. He is bothered by the fact that there are many Christians who go to synagogues. They don't deny their Christianity, but they see the synagogue as a place where you have the sacred books, where you can understand the ideas behind Christianity. And of course, he is afraid, Chrysostom is afraid, that they're going to convert to Judaism and leave the church. So to protect the church, Christianity, and Jesus, he gives 8 homilies, 8 sermons tear the Jews apart. And his purpose is to make these people who go to the synagogues so disgusted by Judaism and what they see. And basically he says, this is not a synagogue. It's a house of demons and devils. It's not a synagogue. You don't find the word of God there, etc. But he doesn't say nice things about the Jew. And we'll see what they have to say about the role of Jew as Christ killer and how that spreads. And we'll talk about that actually in the Gospel of Matthew. And we'll see it's not what we always think it is, but what was done with it later that made it into that horrible, horrible claim. It's interesting that with Beth Am, our shul, a number of years ago, we had a relationship with an African-American church in South Central Los Angeles. And we would read with them, study texts with them, biblical texts. It's amazing. They are, fundamentalist. We are modern critical thinkers. You'd think there'd be right? Well, that happened at the beginning, but we understood each other, and we chose to understand each other. So we didn't, skim over. We mentioned those things, but we came to the conclusion that what we were studying was significant and sacred to us. And that solved all the problems. Is it the Word of God? Yes, it is. We just approach it differently. Fine. No problem. And we read. He suggested that we read, never did I? I forgot. We both agreed we should read a crucifixion story. So we read it. We read the book of Matthew, some of the stuff you're going to read. And, there it says, his blood be upon us and upon our children. That's what the Jews say. I'm quoting. We'll talk about that. So we discussed that. And one of our members raised his hand and he says, but, there it says, it's written. I mean, how do you deal with that? According to your interpretation, we today are responsible as were our ancestors. So he said, I was never taught that in seminary. And this is a guy who went to a black cemetery, and seminary, and evangelical African-American seminary. And he said, that was then. Those people are accepting blame for them and their children. That was it. It was never transmitted because Jesus, book of Luke, Jesus said on the cross, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And the only way you can understand these two apparent contradictions is one, what I just said my colleague. And it was clear that this guy was raised, and I don't know, he wasn't Catholic. So what happened in 1965 with Nostra Aetate and the pronouncements of Pope John the 23rd, I don't know if that touched their tradition or not, but there you had it. All right, anyway, so that's the ancient period. The medieval period. We're going to look at what the popes wrote about us. We're going to understand what the reality and what happened with the Crusades. All right, that'll be we're not going to look at a lot of texts because there aren't a lot of texts that my hand went up because you see the hand over there in my picture? That's because I raised my hand. Forget about it. I'm not going to answer. All right, anyway, but you need to understand what the idea behind it was. So we're going to talk about that. But then we are going to read some selections of texts that talk about what Dominicans, Franciscans did, particularly what they did with the Talmud, and how they turned that against the Jew, all right, and their attitude toward the Jew. We will look at some texts that describe blood libels, right, the stories. We are going to look at some demonic cartoons that begin to be in books that are published from the 16th century on that depict Jews in horrific ways, okay? We are going to talk about, I mentioned blood libel. Yeah, I said that, yeah. And then we're going to read some selection from Martin Luther and his book on the lies of the Jews, okay? And we will look at the Quran and its interpretations as a medieval statement, all right? So that's Middle Ages. Now we're going to end up in the modern period. All right. Now we're going to talk about things that you may. This is what's probably going to take a long time because there's a lot of it that we have. Right. We have concrete. We have text. We have clear sources to work with. So we're going to go into the modern period first. Voltaire and the Jews. I don't know if you know that. Voltaire said a lot of nasty things about Jews. And that laid a foundation for the 19th and 20th century anti-Semitism. He's writing it in the 18th century, in the 1700s. The impact of the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, just this as an aside, on Europe and how that affected a large swatch of the European public in terms of their attitudes toward the Jews and what was going and how that spun off. And by the way, it's very interesting. Some of that ended up in Nazism, but there are some tendencies we find today, not only in the United States but in Western Europe and elsewhere, that the social media today and the electronic revolution seems to have had a parallel to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. Very interesting. All right, now getting really deep stuff. You ready? Social Darwinism and linguistic superiority. I will explain those terms and how they are interrelated. Pseudoscience and eugenics. Eugenics, I will read the definition of eugenics from the Oxford, one of the Oxford dictionaries. The study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. Developed largely by Sir Francis Galton as a method of improving the human race, eugenics was increasingly discredited as unscientific and racially biased during the 20th century, especially after the adoption of its doctrine by the Nazis in order to justify their treatment of Jews, disabled people, and other minority groups. That was a big thing for Hitler. But that popped up already in the second half of the 19th. Okay, then we will read segments or summaries of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Okay, jumping ahead for a second, that is one of the books that the Hamas Charter recommends that you read if you want to get a real good picture of Jewish history. That is mentioned verbatim. And by the way, Hitler mentions it as well in Mein Kampf. But this was a concept you're going to still hear in the world today. And we'll talk about that, and you will read some segments of it. Then, of course, we'll talk about Hitler and Nazism. You'll read some selections from Mein Kampf. Okay. By the way, we'll also talk about the fact that we will have read Martin Luther. For a long time, everybody assumed that Lutheranism was not a factor in German anti-Semitic feeling. Okay, because they said, well, the Nazis were not religious people, right? Nazism was their religion. And it's right. They were basically a secular expression. Okay. However, more recent research looking at the voting patterns in 1933, when Hitler was elected, in the areas, remember Germany was sort of divided. There were Catholic areas, there were Lutheran areas, right? Because all kinds of factors, we won't go into that. Okay, but in the clearly areas where the majority of the population was Lutheran, the voting for Hitler was twice what it was elsewhere, 2-to-1 margin in those areas, 2-to-1 in favor of Hitler, as opposed to whatever opponents he had during the election. Okay, which is a clear indication that those people in that part of the country took their Luther at face value. And Luther said some very nasty things, which you will see. So that's an impact from the 16th century down to the 20th century. Time is of no import here. Okay, then we're going to look at the United States between 1900 and 1970. We'll look at things like anti-Semitism, blatant anti-Semitism, attitudes towards Jewish immigration, real estate purchase, employment, okay? All these things that are manifestations of anti-Semitism here. And then we will look at contemporary Islamic anti-Semitism. We will read some selections from the Hamas Charter, all right, which of course is quite relevant today. And we will read some selections of neo-Nazi white supremacy anti-Semitism, which is the other side of the spectrum, and the new emerging anti-Israel anti-Semitism and how that expresses itself and what, the problem with it. So we're going to have our work cut out for us. I hope you can take it because it's not the kind of thing that's going to leave you spiritually uplifted. But the purpose of the class is to help us understand this process, at least somewhat rationally, so we can respond appropriately. And we can talk about that along the way as well. What are the proper responses? Goes back to, I think, where we began with Barbara in terms of this notion that if we understand our sources well, we can respond to these things. And at least if the people who are dyed-in-the-wool anti-Semites, forget it. You just got to have to fight them in court or whatever you got to do, okay? Because they're not going to change their mind. But people who just do it out of naivete, just their superficial as a superficial explanation of problems that they see around them, whether it touches their lives or not, okay? But they see these things and they're scared, okay? And so the Jews are at fault. If you explain that they're willing to listen, and you have the information about how we operate and where there are, issues, that we have to address. Okay, we're human beings like everybody else, but generally what we are and where we stand as American citizens. So that's an important thing to be able to. Okay, we still have some time. I hope you don't mind. I may dismiss you early today because the next segment you will get the information. We're not going to have any spare time. Sometimes we may go over a little bit. We're supposed to end at 1:30. It's an hour and a half class. I understand you may have appointments or whatever that might interfere, but that's perfectly fine. The one thing I would request that you do, whether you have done this in the past or not, I want to have this in an organized fashion. Please send me your email address and the best phone number for reaching you, okay? I know some of you have taken other classes with me, but do me a favor so I don't have to schlep back and find everything or go to the Beth Am directory. Just send them to me, email and best phone number, so that if there are changes, because there are going to be, in January, I can tell you we're going to have to move a meeting. Okay, I'm telling you now, as we get closer, we'll deal with it. But pretty much we can, I hope, manage with the dates that I've laid out. Okay? All right.
What is your email, Rabbi Rembaum? Your email.
Oh, my email, right. You don't know that. Okay. All right. It's all lowercase. J. Rembaum, JREMBAUM at TBALA.org. Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles. TBALA.org. Okay? And my cell phone number, which you can have as well, ready, is 310-922-0673. Okay? All right, Bert.
In today's world, I'm talking about this again. Some of us have children or grandchildren. Jews are pretty much Jews by choice. Way back in the day, there really was no choice.
Yeah.
But today, most Jews are Jews by choice. Mm-hmm. And the problem of feeling hated so easily makes children and grandchildren kind of want to hide. And then there's a part of a parent, we have a granddaughter who lives in Paris, and what do you say? You say, watch out, keep your head down. Don't be too Jewish. So I'm not sure what my question is, but I think that the issue of anti-Semitism today, as it affects us, is different from it was when we couldn't opt out of being Jewish. Because today people can. And so I liked your answer before. You said, no pride in being Jewish.
Yeah, right. I mean, I understand that. And, there are situations where you don't want to walk around with a kippah because somebody might just jump on you. You don't know. I understand that problem. And it has happened. Or at the very least, somebody's going to come up to you and say something nasty, and it's going to make you feel very uncomfortable and maybe become angry, and you may get into a fight. You don't know. All right. I would say, though, the one thing this is where certain kinds of Jewish institutions can be helpful. I have a granddaughter who goes to school at Berkeley. Okay. We know that last year she went through hell because these kids, they live on the social media.
Sure.
And the amount of the percentage of social media garbage that she was getting, berating Israel, anti-Semitic stuff, the full Monty on all that stuff, was really she got depressed. She went to Hillel, and they worked with her on it. And that was helpful. Okay. They supported her. They gave her some ways of responding or just how to absorb it and just say, okay, I know that's not true, and I'll forget about it. Whatever. I don't know their Torah on that, okay? But it seemed to have worked, and she was there. She would be with the group. She knew she wasn't alone, and so forth. To the point where we had lunch with her a couple months ago in Berkeley, and she was talking about what she wants to do professionally. She's a junior now, so she's got to focus her studies on profession. And she said she wanted to get involved somehow in movie industry. So like her big brother. Okay, he's making a movie. All right, that's nothing big yet. He hasn't hit the big time. He's struggling. Sorry, he's not dying. Don't worry. He gets food. He eats. He's okay. I won't go into details. He's fine. Anyhow, but the point is, I said to her, so why don't you switch to UCLA? We got the same problems here as there. We know about that. You know how to deal. There's a good Hillel at UCLA, et cetera, et cetera. She says, no, I like it here in Berkeley. I want to stay here. So the point is, she wouldn't have said that if she really was looking for an out. And here, at least we're here.
Right.
She could come to our place anytime she wanted and sleep or eat or just yell and scream or cry or whatever, which she doesn't have up there. But no, it's okay. I got friends. I got community. Okay, I got it. I'm fine. Great. My point is, so you have a relative in France. Have her go to a synagogue. Have her seek out. There is an organized Jewish community there.
Yeah.
Okay. There is. I have a dear friend here. There is a my friend lives here in Century City. He created an organization that is slowly developing, which is a European equivalent to AIPAC. In other words, an organization that tries to reach out to the people who are in the governments, members of the parliaments in Israel, and help, in Europe, and help them to understand what Israel is about and hope that they will either support Israel or at least be understanding of what Israel goes through. And he's made some progress. And there are, if you want, Bert, I can get you his information or get from him the information about where and with whom to speak.
Yeah, actually, one year when I was there, some friends of ours introduced us to, I think his name is Tom Cohen, who runs
a
French-American congregation there.
Yes, I know him. Yeah, he was a student of mine here.
Yeah. Oh, really? Okay. So most of, this just applies to Paris. Most of the Jews there are Sephardic Orthodox.
Yes.
And but that's a good idea. Thank you.
Yeah, but he's good.
Yeah. No. I think he's still there.
Yeah. But if you want that other information, let me know.
Okay, I'll let you know.
Okay, wait, well, hold on one at a time. All right. Errol?
I got to apologize. While you were talking, I Googled the memorials in Berlin. You mentioned a Holocaust memorial, which was built in 2004, but in 2008, one was built to the Roma's 2012 to the mentally and physically disabled, in 2014 to the Roma and the Sintas.
Yeah.
But what I really wanted to tell you was, having a Lithuanian background, my granddaughter had to do a senior thesis at Bard, and she did a thesis on Holocaust memorials in Lithuania. And it was very interesting. The Holocaust memorials in Lithuania, if you go to Lithuania today, there are hardly any. Now they are beginning to address the issue. But the few survivors of this not Nazi slaughter, but anti-Semitic slaughter by their Catholic neighbors, the few survivors came back to their shtetls, didn't have resources, and built little informal memorials. They didn't have resources, so they used wood and stone, which didn't weather well. So the point of my granddaughter's thesis was she has records of some of these, and the memorials are photographs and memories and stories. That's her conclusion.
Very interesting. Yeah. Well, we encountered something like that in where were we? Right. We went to Poland, and we were the first. It was Warsaw, and the environs, and then we went to Krakow, which of course got us to Auschwitz. And there had been a lot of effort made, to memorialize things. Can't deny it. In certain areas, other areas, nothing. So we went to the town where my family in Poland lived in two communities north of Warsaw. I don't know, let's say 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers, something like that. And they were about 10 kilometers apart. So in the one where my immediate family came from, you go there. We had a guide. Freddie knows somebody of importance in Krakow. No, from the museum in the Jewish museum in Warsaw. She knows the head of the fund that funds that. Okay, and so this person arranged for us to have some wonderful guides, in our travels in Poland. Anyhow, so this guide, who was not a Jewish guy, took us up to this our town, and we walked through, and he showed us this and that, and he said, there is nothing here right now that has any evidence that there were Jews here. Zero. He said, you see this building over here? This used to be the Jewish girls' school. It is now a public high school, but there's no mention, no plaque that says this used to be the Jewish girls' school. Nothing. He said, for years, the only memorial they had was downstairs in the basement on a doorway. You could see an angled space in the doorway where the mezuzah used to be, but they had to fix the doorway. And now that's gone. And but he said, the only reference to Jews is at the old Jewish cemetery. So he drove us to the old Jewish cemetery. This is the town of Nashelsk. He took us to the old Jewish cemetery. And you drive down the road, and he stopped. And you're standing there. And over here, you're looking at an open field with trash and garbage. And over here, you're looking at a field, no longer a field. It's an overgrown with the wild forest. And right in between the two, centered between these two areas, is a metal sign this big, on a piece of metal post, let's say it was this high, whatever, Jewish cemetery in Polish. That was it, period. On the other hand, we went to a town, which is the sort of county seat where my family did not come from, there, it turns out, now I don't know if they did this to promote tourism or what, but that's the town where Ben-Gurion was born. David Ben-Gurion came from that town. His house was bombed out during the bombing, okay, and he obviously had left by then. But so, Sde Boker is the kibbutz in Israel where Ben-Gurion spent a lot of time. That was his home base in the Negev, right? The graduates, the eighth, what grade? I think eighth grade in that school every year goes to that town. They have one of those trees where you add a little leaf with your, who you are on it. That's used for fundraising. We use that in synagogues for fundraising, the tree. Yeah. Every year they go, and it's part of the routine. And there's a big explanation of what that is. Okay. Now, but that brings a connection between that town and Israel. I mean, literally. At the same time, you go into town, there's this building, a blue building, and this big sign, Ben-Gurion lived here. After whatever, at some point, that's where the family was. I don't know what that means, whatever. The point is, it's there. You go to, in Poland, when you go to Auschwitz, Oswiecim is the town. I mean, the name Auschwitz is a German name based upon a misreading, a Germanizing of Oswiecim. Okay. Anyhow, there is a new museum and Jewish center, small, that stands next to one of the old synagogues that survived. And the synagogue is set up, if you want to daven, if you want to have a minyan, you want to say shachrit, or you want to say kaddish, you can go in and do that. There's a little cafe, and there's a very nice small museum, electronic, with pictures and stories of this town. And it turns out that the town itself, for a long time, in the 19th and the first part of the 20th century, there were Jews and Christians who lived together, no problem. There was one wealthy Jewish guy. He had a factory that produced alcoholic beverages of some kind. He employed a lot of people in town. They loved his booze, but they loved him because he was generous. He gave them good jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's sort of the antithesis of what you normally, and the guy who ran the center was a Pole, a non-Jew, who got a master's degree in Jewish studies from Brandeis University and who spoke Hebrew. I mean, it was a real investment. Again, tourism, maybe, but I don't care because it shows that they cared. And the history, he says, is accurate. It's not an exaggeration. There was harmony, and 50% of the population before the war was Jewish, and the other 50% was Catholic, and it was nice. So you get the sense, the fact is, and in talking to other Poles, the country, there were areas where everything you heard about the horror was absolutely true. But it's a big country, and there are other places where it wasn't so. But you can see that, nuanced. And by the way, in the town where Ben-Gurion lived, there is the town council decided to create an archive of families who died during the war, Jewish and non-Jewish. But people, because the whole point was, the horrors of World War II killed a lot of, and by the way, that the Poles, the Nazis hated the Poles. I don't know if you know that. They were just below the Jews in terms of who were quasi-human or less. So they had reason to grieve over the loss of their population. So anyway, this town, there were a number of Jews from the United States who picked up on this, and they showed us the archive. And the archivist, paid for by the town council, she is not Jewish. Nobody there is Jewish. The town council was reaching out to 12 other communities to do the same thing. It's a positive gesture. And it was done in good faith, because that's not something that big sign, come to see the archive with all the stories of the Jews. It's quiet. anyhow, so you have this sense of, you accept the horrors, but know that there are little pockets of humankind, even in a horrible place like that. All right, anyhow, but thank you for that, Earl. It's very good. Yes, Cheryl, go ahead.
This is a technical question about the syllabus that you described to us. As you were going through the periods of history, I was thinking, what about the expulsions from England and Spain?
All the expulsions. Yeah, we can. The thing is, they don't. I know them. I've taught them. I studied them.
I haven't really
They generally do not do not reflect. I mean, the expulsion, the letter of expulsion from Spain, was not that it wasn't virulent. It gave an explanation. That the explanation was because they were drawing conversos back into Judaism, and they were a threat to that community. And also there was some economic thing, but it wasn't this kind of deep-seated stuff. When a number of the people that we will look at, trying to think, among the mendicant friars, there was we'll talk about it. I don't know if there's anything to read, but there were monks in Spain, already in the second half of the 13th century, who were studying Talmudic sources in Hebrew and Aramaic. And in fact, one of the major collections of Midrash from the Middle Ages and before was put together by a monk in around 1270 in Spain. And I've seen copies of it in print form. And it's an amazing collection of Midrash, because what they were trying to do was to use rabbinic sources, not as sources of anti-Jewish descriptions, but as means of trying to convince Jews that their own sources, their own rabbinic sources, can be interpreted as being foreshadowing Jesus. And of course, they got very frustrated when the Jews weren't responding, because the Jews, what I got my doctorate on was dealing with the responses to all that stuff, how the Jews fought back in books against the Christian interpretation of the Bible and against the legitimacy or sanctity of the New Testament, which they tried to prove was a bunch of garbage, and everything it talked about. So, I mean, you had this battle of intelligentsias going on between the two, but that's sort of in another direction. I would say this was in part the result of everything else that we're going to look at.
I was thinking about Chaucer.
What?
Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, in the 1300s, maybe, I forget the year. Yeah. And I know that the Jews were expelled from England before that, even. So the anti-Semitic language in Chaucer is when there are no Jews in the country anymore.
Right. Well, that's an interesting point. Yes. If you remind me, when we get there, it's a complicated thing. There's this concept, the myth of the wandering Jew, and that he was born with the mark of Cain. Remember what God says: "You shall be a navanad tiyabaretz. You will be a wanderer." And the typical image of the wandering Jew, there were pictures drawn of the people would see the wandering Jew. It couldn't be a whole community because they had already gone. I'm talking France, Germany, and things like that. They were gone. But the wandering Jew was this guy, and clearly with Jewish features, with a big, huge sack on his back, bent over, walking. He was a used clothes salesman. He would buy and sell clothing. And he would wander, and people would say, "We saw him." There were no Jews to condemn, but clearly he was part of this degraded, image of the Jew. And at a certain point, because they were so poor, they were, in fact, that in different places actually engaged in the resale of used clothing. But it became part of a myth. Yeah. But that was because of the punishment of Cain and because of, the punishment for killing Jesus. It all was wrapped into one because Cain became the epitome of evil, right? And that was the Jew that defined the Jew. Yeah. So, I mean, if I have there are some pictures of that. I'll tell you one little story, then we'll end. When we lived in Jerusalem, this was 73, 74, right after the war. So our apartment, the apartment that we were leasing, looked out over a huge field, an open, undeveloped field, and it was Arab shepherds would bring their sheep there and their goats and move on because, during the year, there was a lot of growth and these guys could come in and eat anything. So they were the big, fat, very healthy looking sheep and goats. Okay. I learned the meaning of tsigenebubkes over there. You ever hear the Yiddish term tsigenebubke?
It is a goat.
A tzig is a goat. What's a bubke? A little thing.
Oh, bubkes is not the
So what are tsigenebubkes? Goat droppings. When these shepherds finished, the field was covered with tsigenebubkes. So my father-in-law used to use that term all the time. May he rest in peace. And there they were right before our eyes. Thank you, But from time to time, an Arab would walk through the field shouting out in Yiddish with a big sack over his back. And he would be saying, this is what I heard, Al Tizachin, Al Tizachin. Arabic, right? It's Yiddish. Al Tizachin.
We lived in Israel the same time you did, and I used to hear that in my neighborhood too.
You did too. And
I thought, what is he saying? It sounds like Arabic, but it sounds like Yiddish too.
It is. It's Al Tizachin, old things.
Someone explained.
Yes. And I showed it to Freddie, and I saw that. I said, oh my God, history has been totally reversed.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org